Hi APUSH students, this is Kowski, and in this video we're going to be reviewing the entire curriculum for APUS history in preparation for the upcoming APUSH exam. I do want to make the disclaimer, by no means is this considered an exhaustive review or replacement for not studying for the entire year. However, this is a good refresher for right before the exam. So let's get into it. So period one, main idea here is that Native American tribes are adapting significantly to the geography around them. It's very much a misnomer to refer to all Native Americans in the United States as being the same tribe and having the same features. Really, you're going to see them adapting to their geography, which is ultimately going to be shaping their culture. For example, in the Great Plains, based on the geography, they're living off of the land with hunting and gathering. Also similar in the Pacific Northwest, hunter and gatherers. And then we also see cultural differences, such as with the Iroquois Confederacy being matriarchally based, meaning that women are controlling and making the decisions since they are more at the home base, whereas the men are out hunting and gathering. Also important to know during period one is the Columbian Exchange, which is going to lead to the introduction of not only crops and animals that both Europe and North America have never seen before, but also disease, in particular smallpox. So in period one, they usually like to have a good graph of the declining Native American population, and you can attribute that squarely on smallpox. And also in the Spanish colonies, we're going to see the rise of the encomienda system, which was very, very harsh, very much akin to slavery of the Native Americans. And Las Casas is going to speak out and condemn it, and this is going to bring the end of that eventually for Native Americans. Unfortunately, this will begin the African slave trade into the Spanish colonies. Now, within the Spanish colonies, we're going to see a caste system that's not completely rigid. If you had Spanish and blood and you married a Native American, that child would be higher than the Native American parent, and it allowed for some mobility over generations. But if you were from the Iberian Peninsula and had all Spanish blood, you were a peninsulare at the top, and you would be really seen as the most important of that system. So as we go into period two right now, it is important to know that colonies are going to be established for a variety of reasons. Particularly, they're going to be based on economics or religion. For example, in the Jamestown colony, they are motivated by the idea and prospect of gold. Of course, that's not going to pan out until we get something similar, brown gold, tobacco. But in the Plymouth colony, for example, this is more motivated for religious reasons. And one of the things that we're going to see is the Mayflower Compact. Some actually refer to this as the first U.S. Constitution. I think that goes a little too far, but it is sort of a seed of democracy that you want to certainly keep in mind. In Pennsylvania, of course, we have William Penn with his Grand Holy Experiment. And then in Maryland, for religious reasons, Lord Calvert. It will be a safe haven in particular for Catholics. And in Georgia, this will be a safe haven for former debtors and prisoners, where they'll sort of be, I don't want to say banished, but that's where the colony that they would go. Also, Georgia served as a buffer between the colonies and the Spanish colony in Spanish Florida at that time, so it also served in that regard as well. It's important to note, though, that in period two, we are seeing the seeds of democracy, as I mentioned with the Mayflower Compact. They're going to blossom later. Certainly, they're not going to be this humongous democracy yet, but they are planting the seed. So we see this, for example, in Virginia with the House of Burgesses. We also see this during this long time period of salutary neglect, where England is basically going to be hands off, essentially allowing the colonies to govern themselves, and that's going to give the colonists a taste of some freedom in decision making. We'll also have the Great Awakening, which is going to be the first uniquely American experience together, as at this point, a lot of the colonies are very different, and this is going to be the first unified religious experience, hence an awakening at this point, and then, as I mentioned earlier, with the Mayflower Compact. Now, one of the reasons for colonies is mercantilism, and that is, of course, economically driven, where the mother country, England, is trying to profit off of the colonies. And one of the ways that they're going to do this is through taxation, and that is seen through the Navigation Acts, which is really the start of mercantilism. So keep that in mind. This is an economic relationship between Britain and the 13 colonies. Now, European nations are certainly scattered throughout North America, and they had different relationships with the Native Americans. I have seen this many, many times on a short answer question, so it's very important to know this. For example, the British had awful relationships with the Native Americans. Look at King Philip's War, which is basically going to wipe them out in the New England area. They do not marry. They are completely separate. Whereas the French had actually really good relations. It was based on trade. You even saw some intermarriage. And then the Spanish, certainly we had the encomienda system, but there was intermarriage being allowed. So that was not as rigid as we saw with the British. So those are the main ideas of period 2. Let's move on right now to period 3. So we have the French and Indian War, and the colonies fought alongside of the British, and you have, of course, have that famous join or die cartoon that makes its way and will have a different meaning during the Revolutionary War. But this is going to cause a rift between the colonies and the British. The proclamation line of 1763 is going to go along the Appalachian Mountains, and the colonists are very curious as what lays beyond in the west. And the British say you can't go beyond there because they do not want fights with the Native Americans. So this is going to cause a rift. Hey, we were part of this war, we helped you win, and as a result, we should be, allowed to go west. But the British are going to say no. Now, in terms of mercantilism, as we talked about, that's going to be ramping up as well. And salutary neglect is going to the wayside. So they had this taste of freedom, sovereignty, and now it's being taken away. So the colonies are going to begin to unify themselves as we go closer to the Revolutionary War. Keep in mind some of the major economic causes here. You don't need to know and memorize every single act by heart, but these are some of the major ones. First one being the Stamp Act and going on progressively with the coercive acts following the Boston Tea Party. Also note some of the political causes here, the Enlightenment, the idea that life, liberty, property, John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau are going to be very much causes for these colonists to eventually rise up. And we see this sort of coming to fruition in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, one of the most widely read pamphlets, more than 500,000 copies distributed throughout the colonies. And again, salutary neglect. There it goes. Once again, this is a huge, huge cause of the Revolutionary War. So we see some attempts for the colonists to come together. We see this in the First Continental Congress. We also see this with respect to the Committee of Correspondence, coordinating boycotts. It's going to be one of the primary methods that's going to be used prior to the Revolutionary War. And then once we have the Second Continental Congress, we will essentially be leading to this Declaration of Independence. So once war is declared, our ill-prepared Continental Army is going to try to come together. It's a ragtag, a group of people essentially going up against one of the most important and strongest armies in the world. And early on, you have the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. You have a small moral victory at Bunker Hill. Trenton with George Washington surprising the Hessian soldiers on Christmas. And then the Battle of Saratoga. If I had to tell you to remember one particular battle, it would be Saratoga, because that is going to be the turning point of the Revolutionary War, as the French are going to join the colonists, as they do have an axe to grind with the British as well. And General Lafayette being important in terms of his military background in training troops. So after winning the war, I like to devise this as saying that this was the easy part. Devising the new government was the more difficult part. So we're going to devise the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution. The problem here is too much power is given to the states and very little power is given to the national government. So the Articles of Confederation are put together, but once Shays' Rebellion happens, where you have a rebellion that the U.S. cannot put down, the Founding Fathers get a little bit concerned, and they will convene in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, and they will try to set up our new Constitution, which we have today. So it's important to know that we have the Great Compromise, which is going to create one chamber of Congress, the House of Representatives, based on population, and another chamber based on the Senate, based on equal representation, which is known as the Senate. We will also see the 3/5 compromise, the unwillingness to really deal with slavery and count slaves as 3/5 of a person. Now, the anti Federalists are very, very concerned at this point. They do not want to sign on to this new document giving up state power, and it's the Bill of Rights that's going to be utilized to appease them and get ratification of our Constitution. And once we have the Whiskey Rebellion, unlike Shays' Rebellion, we see that the Constitution actually works and you can put down a rebellion. So how should this new nation look going forward with our Constitution? Well, you have the Federalists, who are Hamilton types, who prefer a national bank, an economy based on industry, favoring more the north and city urban areas, and a loose interpreter of the Constitution. In contrast, Jefferson wants a country based on agriculture. He's a strict interpreter of the Constitution. If it's not stated in the Constitution, it is not constitutional from his point of view. He's favoring states' rights, no national bank. And so, again, this very much encapsulates the two main factions that are going to rise up early on in our country's history. Now, Washington will be the first president. He's going to be important. He sets the precedent of neutrality and 2 terms, even though 2 terms is not in our Constitution until the 22nd Amendment. But one of the things that Washington is going to warn against in his farewell address, very important that you know about the farewell address, because he's going to say, stay isolated, do not get involved in Europe. They're always having affairs, foreign wars and affairs. And Washington is warning against sectionalism between, in particular, the North and the South. And boy, is he correct. He's warning against political parties. So definitely be aware of Washington's farewell address. Important to know. And then we have John Adams, and his presidency in the late 1790s is very much categorized by the rise of sectionalism. And we'll also see him as the first Federalist president. And he does a really good job of keeping the United States out of war, in particular with France, with the XYZ affair. But we will also see some political maneuvering here by Federalists, in particular with the Alien and Sedition Acts. And why this is important is because the South, in particular Kentucky and Virginia, are going to try to nullify this particular law that was aimed against Democrats, the Democratic Republicans, that is. And so remember, when we get to the Civil War, we'll also have an act of nullification as well. So this is the first act of nullification, very important to note. Okay, on to period 4 here. And as we are a young nation, the national government is going to be expanding its powers quite significantly in the 1800s, thanks to the Supreme Court. In particular, judicial review is going to be established. Thank you, John Marshall. And we're going to see that 2 important Supreme Court cases, along with Marbury v. Madison, Gibbons v. Ogden, is going to be using the Commerce Clause. And that's going to expand the muscle and power of the national government over the states. And that's also similar to McCulloch v. Maryland, which is going to establish the use of a national bank. And Maryland is going to say, wait, you're not allowed to do that. We're going to tax you. And the national government's going to say, no, you're not. And you're going to see the use of the Elastic Clause saying, well, the national government can do what it deems necessary and proper, and it sure does. Now, while Jefferson is the president, he's trying to make the nation more agrarian. That was one of his aspirations. He's state-oriented, but largely does fall short of these goals. But what he is, of course, known for is increasing the size of our country, thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. But perhaps the most unpopular action of his presidency is going to be the Embargo Act, where he is basically going to forbid the United States from trading with Europe, which is always embroiled in affairs. And this is going to hurt northern industry, and it's one of the more unpopular actions that he's going to undertake. Now, after he leaves office, we're going to see the United States is going to get involved in the War of 1812. We see the British and the Native Americans out in the Ohio Valley territory that are still causing a nuisance to the United States. So we have what are known as these war hawks, who are these congressmen who are desiring war with Britain. And we even have Federalists, remember, who are Anglophiles, who are sympathetic with the British, plotting to potentially secede. So our first act of secession, really, in terms of being plotted, is not the Civil War. It dates back to the War of 1812. And ultimately, this is going to be the end for the Federalist Party, as they're going to sort of be seen as traitors. You do not need to know all the battles, but it's important to know sort of the political causes, economic causes, and the aftermath. But one of the big battles that's going to happen here is the Battle of New Orleans, and it's going to make Jackson a national hero. And of course, an eventual president. So this time after the war, the United States reaffirms its independence for not just the first time, the second time here. And the era of good feelings is going to follow. We're going to see nationalism increase during this period. But keep in mind, sectionalism is still an issue. Tariffs in the North are still an issue. And we're going to have our first financial problem, and that's going to culminate into the Panic of 1819. So really, it's somewhat short-lived, this era of good feelings, but we're going to be ramping up sectionalism very much after 1819, as we'll see the Missouri Compromise coming about very soon. Now, one thing that's going to emerge during period 4 is that the United States is going to really have its first foreign policy, and that, of course, is known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is characteristic of being relatively isolationist, as it wants to keep out of Western Europe. It wants Western Europe and really the Eastern Hemisphere to stay out of the United States' business. And so Monroe is going to craft this as if it's going to be protecting the little brothers of Latin America. But this stays true to Washington's farewell address, which of course is going to espouse isolationist types of policy, only to get involved with respect to treaties and alliances that are commercial only. Now, after this great period of era of good feelings, we're going to see sectionalism really ramp up, and this is of course going to be thanks to slavery. But Henry Clay is going to try to merge the North and the South together through his American system, as you see the aspects here. However, again, slavery is really going to be cutting through a lot of this. This was a noble attempt, but the Missouri Compromise is significant, otherwise known as the Compromise of 1820, because now you're going to finally establish lines for future states. Anything above the Missouri line is going to come in as a free state. Anything below that is going to come in as a slave state. And again, that's going to try to keep that delicate balance in Congress. But as the United States is moving west, this is going to complicate issues. You even have the Wilmot Proviso, for example, which is going to say future territories should automatically come in as free states. That, of course, does not pass, but that ramps up the sectionalism between the North and the South. Also occurring during this time is women's rights and slave rights are growing, and we see this really come to fruition in the Declaration of Sentiments, which is the first real document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, really asking for women to gain rights. And they even go so far as accusing husbands, for example, perhaps tongue-in-cheek here, of being their oppressors, but in some ways, of course, showing how they are indeed second-class citizens. And they convene together at the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the first large-scale meeting where you have women's rights advocates. So this is sort of known as the birth movement for women's rights. Also happening at this time, you're going to have some very important publications, David Walker's Appeal and William Lloyd's The Liberator, and that's going to be advocating for slaves' rights and for abolition. So certainly that's going to be gaining momentum, and that's connected here to sectionalism. Also during this time, we have the rise of the common man, and we'll have the Democratic Party coming about, and this happens really under Andrew Jackson, who we know he is going to use the presidency to benefit himself. But one thing that he's really good at doing is really connecting with the common man. However, we see a lot of his presidency bogged down in a lot of major issues. One of the reasons why he sort of catapults to this common person is the corrupt bargain, where the election of 1824 is swayed away from him to John Quincy Adams. And so that leaves a bad taste, and in 1828 he's going to reclaim the presidency. But of course we know the spoils system. That is of course where he's going to reward people who are loyal to him. He's going to fire 10,000 federal officials. Also during this time, the Tariff of Abomination, which is going to culminate in the nullification crisis, and he's even threatening to hang his own vice president. Think about that, in South Carolina. Also happening during this point, Andrew Jackson is a big opponent of the national bank, and he basically is going to be depleting it and putting money into the pet banks. And we see this also with the Specie Circular, and this is going to eventually cause another panic in 1837 under his vice president, who will become the president, Van Buren, and that is a direct result of his pet banks. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to have a minor party, the Whig Party, that's basically all anti-Jackson for these aforementioned reasons. So it's a party that's going to come about. It's going to be relatively short-lived, but again, it's all against Andrew Jackson. During this time, too, we have the Trail of Tears, and despite the fact that in the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia that says that the Cherokees have a rightful land claim and should not be allowed to be moved, you see Andrew Jackson, sort of King Jackson from that iconic political cartoon, ignoring that anyway. So we will see Andrew Jackson serve his 2 terms. Van Buren will also serve 1 term, and that is mired by the Panic of 1837 as a result of his predecessor's policies. Now, during the 1800s, this concept of manifest destiny is going to captivate the minds and hearts of Americans, and we're going to see that this is going to culminate into major land grabs, and I don't even have it listed here, but the Texas Revolution, which is going to spell into the Mexican-American War. Major idea here is that the United States is going to be increasing the amount of land significantly. So we're talking present-day states like New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Texas, California, and this is going to be part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which essentially is the Manifest Destiny Treaty, if you will, expanding the United States. And this was also believed that they were destined by God to expand from the east to the west, in particular to the Pacific Ocean. And during this time, you're going to have more conflicts with Native Americans, and this is going to culminate in the removal of the buffalo, for example. And so we see these former colonists, now Americans, encroaching more and more into the West, setting up for more conflicts. All right, let's get into period 5 here, and we're going to have the rise of the Republican Party. In period 4, we talked about the rise of sectionalism, and ultimately, we're going to see that the Republican Party is going to come out as an anti-slavery type of political party. And this comes out of the Free Soil Party, hence the idea of free soil. And this is going to also culminate between Lincoln and Douglas, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where the Republican Party is going to emerge for its anti-slavery stance. So very, very important to know. And we'll have sectionalism really ramping up during this time period, as we'll have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this is going to allow for the citizens to ultimately decide if they want to become a free or slave state. The problem is you're going to have a lot of outsiders pouring in to vote here, and this is going to culminate into bloody Kansas. Also problematic during this time is the Compromise of 1850, also allowing for popular sovereignty, as well as the Fugitive Slave Act, in which the North would theoretically have to return slaves who escaped from the South back to the South. And this is going to really, really enrage the North, and going to, again, further increase tensions here. We also have John Brown, who was at Bloody Kansas. We also have him at Harper's Ferry. He will be executed as an abolitionist zealot. We also have the awful Dred Scott decision, with slaves being, brought above the Missouri line, are going to still be said to not be citizens. And again, this is enraging the North. And we will see him also being a rallying cry for abolition. And then the election of 1860, keep in mind this is a short-term cause, as once Lincoln is elected, then we will officially see the South begin to secede. So it's important to note that the early parts of the Civil War for Lincoln is really to preserve the Union. It's really not so much about slavery, but it's about preservation of the Union. So the Confederate States under Jefferson Davis are going to secede, and they're going to fall one by one. However, we're going to see the border states, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky, not secede at all. And again, slavery is allowed in these 4 states because the Union does not want to lose them. We will see that coming about. Now, for the Union, their plan is really the anaconda plan. Think of a snake, where it's going to try to suffocate the South in a 3-pronged approach here, whereas the Confederates' plan is really just playing defense, really keep the Union at bay as much as possible. But both sides are going to have to engage in conscription, which is basically a fancy word for the draft. So we have the draft being used for the first time. And we're also going to see deadlier weapon technology. So this is why it's going to be one of the bloodiest wars that are going to be fought from the United States. Now, some of the major battles, you don't really need to know big battles here. They're really focusing on the major issues. And one of the more important ones is the Battle of Antietam, which is a turning point along with Gettysburg, but in particular why Antietam is because of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is going to establish a new purpose for the war. And of course, that is going to be for ending slavery. Coupled with that is something called the Confiscation Acts, which basically said captured slaves are contraband, and thus the Union could absorb them into the army because slaves were providing some labor for the Confederates. So therefore, we see the Union trying to take that asset away from the South. And the use of total war will be utilized by General, not President Grant, my apologies, to end the war. So anything and everything is going to be destroyed. We'll also see this culminate into Sherman's march to the seas in Atlanta, to the Atlantic Ocean. And also, we'll officially see the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where the Civil War will be officially ended. Now, the Civil War, fighting that, of course, is very deadly and awful. But here comes the trickier part in many respects is Reconstruction. There are various plans. Keep in mind we have a few factions here. We have the Radical Republicans who want to stick it to the South. They have the strongest and the most punitive plan. Whereas Lincoln, before he was assassinated, basically just had the 10% plan of a 10% loyalty oath. His VP, Johnson, who will take over here, really is very sympathetic to the South. However, you're going to see him pardoning Confederates. He's going to be vetoing common sense ideas in legislation like the Civil Rights Act, even the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to help literally these freedmen adjust into society here. Radical Republicans, on the other hand, are eventually going to take Reconstruction out of President Johnson's hands because they see him more of an obstacle. So we're going to see the establishment of military districts, and we're going to see the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments coming about. But definitely know that the Radical Republicans have the strongest plan, and they're going to take over Johnson. They're going to be overruling his veto, and consequently, we're going to see some improvements here. So we do have some important initiatives that are going to come out of Reconstruction. As I said here, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Good way to remember these three. Free citizens vote. So the 13th Amendment makes them free. 14th Amendment makes them citizens. 15th Amendment allows for black males to vote. So free citizens vote. Also during this time, we're going to have the Civil Rights Act of 1866 outlawing discrimination. Freedmen's Bureau, as I mentioned here. And this, you'll see a good productive result here. Hiram Revels being the first black U.S. senator. So quite a significant feat. However, many setbacks here. You're going to have sharecropping and tenant farming, very much akin to slavery. You're going to see a lot of Confederates who are going to take office very much later in 1872 after the Amnesty Act. You're going to see the Black Codes, which is going to evolve into Jim Crow laws. And by 1877, after the election of Hayes, you're going to see in return for having the South not contest Hayes winning the election, you're going to see Reconstruction officially ending. All right, now we are into period 6, known as the Gilded Age, and this is a time marked by laissez-faire principles where the United States is basically hands off the economy, and there's very few protections from the federal government in the workplace. And this is not a great time to be a worker, however, a great time to be Carnegie, Morgan, Vanderbilt, or Rockefeller. And this is going to be known as a time where monopolies are going to be rampant as a result of two different methods in which if you employ vertical integration, you are buying up the entire supply line. So you basically dominate that and control all aspects of the supply chain. Whereas with horizontal integration, you are buying up all of your competitors instead. Either way, you are leading to a monopoly. And in particular, J.P. Morgan is going to be so wealthy that during the Panic of 1893, he's actually going to have to bail out the United States government with $60 million. So if you take a sort of a more negative approach here, you would call them more of a robber baron. But if you're talking more of a benevolent idea that they're creating jobs and they're donating, you would call them more of a captain of industry, and note sort of the nuances between these two terms here. Now, the gospel of wealth is going to emerge under Carnegie, and the idea of the gospel of wealth is that they had an obligation, essentially, to donate their large fortunes instead of squandering them on this extravagant wealth, and that they have to use their money for the greater good. But this is sort of be up to them. And so this is really going to usher in the idea that they should engage in philanthropy and charity, and sort of they're taking more of the active role as opposed to the U.S. government with welfare programs that are not going to really begin to emerge until really during the Great Depression. And really, they're going to also justify their wealth by social Darwinism, that basically take the scientific idea that the corporation that's the strongest and that can survive should really be the one that's going to dominate and reap all of the wealth here. Now, during this time, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government often protected and promoted business over regulation. There are very few laws. And during the Great Strike of 1877, we even see President Hayes sending in the federal troops to put down labor violence. Similarly, during the Pullman strike, we're going to see President Cleveland also intervening not on behalf of the workers, but on behalf of the businesses. So this is going to create a movement to unionize and fight back. And the federal government, very, very incrementally, is going to be imposing some regulations. One of the earliest formations of unions or coming together would be with farmers in the Granger movement, who are going to demand more regulation. They are getting charged discriminatory railroad rates, and they come together and are going to be somewhat successful in getting some regulation of railroad rates. You're going to see the rise of the AFL, very important to know, by Samuel Gompers, also the American Railway Union by Eugene Debs. He will come about also in period 7, Knights of Labor. And so we're going to see the early parts here of some regulation, the Interstate Commerce Act, and then also the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is going to make it illegal to form monopolies. But this is going to lack significant teeth and actually is going to be going after unions actually first, as opposed to some of these bigger monopolies. But a lot of these reforms are going to be taken in by the populist party that's going to emerge, and it's going to desire a graduated income tax, direct election of senators. At this point, they are appointed by the state legislatures. Unlimited coinage of silver for inflation, as the farmers and the Democrats are going to certainly be touting and believing that that is a much better way to support the economy. And in come the 1896 election with Democratic William Jennings Bryan, who's going to run for president. And he will lose, but one thing that's very important to mention here is his cross of gold speech, where he's basically saying the gold standard that Republicans are espousing is really going to lead to the death of American workers. His famous quote, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." So this is going to set up, one of the best campaign speeches at the Democratic National Convention in 1896. Now, of course, as I said, he does lose, but this highlights the plight of debt-ridden farmers, in particular, where, of course, our Republicans, known as the gold bugs, want a currency based on the gold standard. All right. So also in period 6 to mention, we're going to have a second wave of immigrants, this time from Southern and Eastern Europe. And we're going to have a nativist backlash here. So there are push and pull factors. Some are looking to escape dictatorships, religious persecution, while others are looking to come to the United States for the purpose of jobs, the economy. Yet it's critical to note that, again, there is this nativist backlash. We're going to see in particular the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is going to essentially try to eliminate all Chinese immigration to the United States. We will also see the American Protective Association, the Immigration Restriction League. These are two examples of nativist leagues that are going to come out against immigration. And during this time, we'll have the social gospel movement, which essentially said that middle-class Protestants had an obligation to address some of the social ills of society, whether it be alcoholism, crime, racial tensions. And one of this is going to be directed toward the immigrants who are coming here with basically no money, no education. And Jane Addams, amongst others, are going to be part of the settlement houses, are going to be important in terms of the tenement movement here, and providing services for poor immigrants, also including immigration in terms of also Americanizing them as well. We'll also see political machines, particularly in city areas, that are going to rise up in terms of trying to offer services in exchange for votes. And this is going to be very, very popular with immigrants just arriving. And perhaps the best example being Boss Tweed, in the Boss Tweed ring that's going to emerge in New York City in the scandals, as they are offering basically services in exchange for votes. Now, one thing that's important to mention here is the discrimination of black Americans is going to continue. We see this with Jim Crow laws. We'll also see this with the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which is going to uphold separate but equal laws. So that's going to continue all the way up until the 1950s, until Brown v. Board of Education reverses that. We'll also see that lynchings are occurring. We'll see grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, ways to basically prevent black Americans from voting. And this sets up a big debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois as to how to proceed. Booker T. Washington, who founds the Tuskegee Institute, believed that it's important to focus on economic rights and the basically empowering black Americans to take care of their financial situations first, get jobs, and then demand political equality. Whereas Du Bois is going to be demanding full-scale equality, 100%. And so this ignites sort of in a fight between these two, or two factions that are going to emerge, where Washington's okay with sort of this gradual easement into rights, whereas Du Bois is going to be demanding full-scale equality. Now, this is going to lead essentially into the Great Migration, where you're going to have thousands of black Americans tired of discrimination, looking to sort of escape the South, go to a little bit more of a better refuge. Not to say that there was not discrimination in the North. Absolutely there was. And so we're going to see migration into major cities, Detroit, into New York, for example, amongst other cities in the Northeast. And the first major interest group that's going to emerge is the NAACP, which is going to be essential for advocating for black Americans' rights. So we will see them playing a pivotal role, particularly within the 20th century. All right, now we are into period 7, and period 7 is defined as through many different ideas. The first one being imperialism. This is important because now no longer is the United States being the one imperialized. They are doing the imperializing. So one of the reasons for this, certainly for money, military basis, this idea of social Darwinism is going to come about again, religious reasons, and an extreme nationalism known as jingoism. So some of the early acquisitions of land, Hawaii, we'll also see that very important with Sanford Dole and Queen Liliuokalani. We'll also see that the Spanish-American War is going to come about, and this is with the imperialistic backdrop of course, yellow journalism, where this is sensational headlines. And we see the explosion of the USS Maine, and we see that newspapers are automatically accusing the Spanish of blowing it up. However, later evidence is going to find that that really was not the case. We'll also see the Delome letter igniting tensions between Spain and the United States as they intercept that diplomat's letter. Teddy Roosevelt will also be part of this war and joining the Rough Riders, as of course we'll later see him as president. Now, what's important to note is that at the beginning of the Spanish-American War, the United States sends the Teller Amendment and passes this, and it basically was part of McKinley's war message that said that the United States, after the war, would give Cuba their freedom. Yet, after the war, we'll see the Platt Amendment, which is going to essentially establish a military presence in Cuba off of Guantanamo Bay, which the United States still has today. So the United States will have control over Guam, Puerto Rico, as well as the Philippines after this. But what's interesting is that there is a series of cases known as the insular cases that are not going to be granting any citizenship, even though they are under the United States. So they are not entitled to the United States rights and citizen privileges that ordinary Americans would have at this point. Now, in terms of foreign policy, it has very much evolved dramatically, starting in the time with Washington, right? Isolation, form no alliances unless commercial relations only. We have the Monroe Doctrine sort of continuing this idea of isolation, not getting involved in Europe, and Europe not getting involved with the United States in the West. And this will begin to change with Teddy Roosevelt, with the Roosevelt Corollary, the idea that the U.S. would use force to protect economic interests in Latin America. So speak softly, but carry a big stick, as you know, as he would say. And then following him, Taft would sort of continue a foreign policy, but this time taking a little bit of an economic stance known as dollar diplomacy, where the government would guarantee loans made to other countries by U.S. businesses to promote commercial interests. So certainly using economics in terms of the foreign policy here. And then by the time we get to Wilson, he changes this a slightly, and this is going to be known as mission diplomacy, where he would deny, or the United States would deny, recognition to any Latin American government that is undemocratic or hostile to democracy. And so this is going to very much change. So be very, very familiar as to the foreign policy stances of these presidents here. Now, at this point, we have the Progressive Era. And one of the reasons the Progressive Era comes about is because of the muckrakers, and I've listed a few here. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is going to really ignite a lot of change because, again, there's no regulation in meat packing facilities and really no regulation on child labor. And you have people getting injured and killed. And so this is going to spur a very important movement and create a number of different pieces of legislation. We'll also see the temperance movement going underway here, and that will come to fruition with the 18th Amendment later on in the early 1900s. But keep in mind that the Progressive Era has a lot of reforms, not just at the national level, but more particularly at the local and state level. So we have initiatives, referenda, recalls. We will see the 16th, 17th, and 18th and 19th Amendments coming about, and these are our Progressive Era amendments. So now we're going to have a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, alcohol prohibition, and of course, after World War I, women's suffrage. Now, when you think of the Progressive Era, oftentimes Teddy Roosevelt's name comes to mind. And during his 2 terms, he's going to usher in a number of progressive reforms. And this is going to be under his domestic program known as the Square Deal. And this is going to be focused on consumer protection, control of monopolies, and conservation. Now, he was a trust buster, breaking up large monopolies, but it's important to note that not every type of trust was necessarily a bad thing. He differentiated between good trust and bad trust. So he's trying to give a fair deal, if you will, as a square is equal on all sides. And that was sort of his approach here. But you will see key legislation here, the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and then also with conservation, the New Lands Act. And this really encompasses his philosophy in the Square Deal, especially with conservation, as we will see national parks also coming about under Teddy Roosevelt. Now, his predecessors, Taft and Wilson, are going to continue progressive reforms. Taft is going to prosecute actually more trust than Roosevelt, but cared less about Wilson. We'll see a rift come between Taft and Roosevelt. Wilson is going to attack what's called the triple wall of privilege. These are trust, tariffs, and high finance. He's going to even pass a better Sherman Antitrust Act. This is known as the Clayton Antitrust Act, and also creates the FTC. So we see varying levels of progressive reforms ushered in during this period.